The 15th of October 1994 saw a violent collision between two trains on a single line near the small town of Cowden in Kent, England. These kind of incidents would normally generate the same kind of questions. Who was involved? How did this come to be? Where did it happen? When exactly did it take place? And how did we allow these circumstances to pass? But in this particular instance, one of the burning questions, especially with regard to one of the trains in particular, was whether the train driver was driving at all. The 15th of October was a Saturday, and the day was subject to very dense fog that was lying low throughout the stretch of line between Oxted and Uckfield that spanned much of rural Kent. The line had originally been composed of two separate tracks, but in 1990, sections of the track had been reduced to a single line to reduce the cost of keeping the line open. This meant that at certain points along the route, trains would have to stop and wait for each other to clear particular sections of single line before they could complete the journeys. On this particular day, service 2 Echo 27, the 0800 departure from Uckfield bound for Oxted, was arriving at Ashurst. As the train had approached Ashurst, it had gone past signal Oscar Delta 58 Romeo. These type of signals are signals that are designed to repeat the aspect that's being displayed by another signal further along the line, and the signal it applied to was around a half a mile the other side of Ashurst station. Oscar Delta 58 Romeo was showing a yellow aspect, which meant that the signal it applied to, Oscar Delta 58, was at danger. It was showing a red aspect, and this meant that the single line had not yet been cleared for 2 Echo 27's onward journey towards Cowden. Oscar Delta 58 was at danger because it was protecting the single line at Blackham Junction, which is where the two lines go to one. Now beyond that, service 2 Echo 24, the 0804 departure from Oxted to Uckfield, had just departed Cowden Station, right in the middle of that single line, and it was heading for Ashurst. Signaller SW Webb was on duty at Oxted signal box. He had set the route to allow 2 Echo 24 to exit the single line at Blackham Junction and then continue into Ashurst Station, and from thence continue to Uckfield. Until 2 Echo 24 had arrived at Ashurst and cleared Blackham Junction, Signaller Webb couldn't really do anything else, so he went to prepare his breakfast, only to be brought back to the signal frame by the sounding of an alarm. The alarm was for point 532 at Blackham Junction. They'd been forced into the wrong position, which meant a train had run through them in the wrong direction. Signaller Webb saw that there were two trains on the single line heading for each other, and there was nothing he could do to prevent the imminent collision. Two trains had violently come together on a single line in rural Kent, England. 5 people lay dead in the mangled and twisted wreckage. 3 members of train crew, drivers Boyd and Rees, and the guard from 2 Echo 27, guard Jonathan Brett Andrews, had lost their lives in the collision. In addition to this, 2 passengers from 2 Echo 27, Mr. and Mrs. Pointer, had also been killed. Investigators subsequently calculated that the trains had only been travelling at between 20 to 30 miles an hour when they'd come together. However, despite this relatively low speed, the damage was horrendous. This was largely because the trains are comprised of Mark I rolling stock. This type of rolling stock was built in the 1950s, and crashworthiness was not the main consideration. The chassis and the bodies of these trains were built completely separately from each other and only welded together at a later point. Now this meant that in crashes they had a tendency to separate from each other, and under the forces of the impact, one chassis would tend to ride up over another one and slice into the survival space afforded by the body of that carriage. On the Class 205, the trains involved at Cowden, this was made even worse by the fact that the engine for the train was mounted above the chassis level, immediately behind the driving cab and immediately in front of the first class compartment. At the point of impact, that engine had been shoved back into the first class compartment, sadly crushing Mr. and Mrs. Pointer. Trainman Boyd, meanwhile, who was the guard on 2 Echo 24, hadn't even been aware that it had actually been a collision. He'd felt a crunch or a bump, as he termed it, but he thought that the driver had accidentally activated the train's emergency brake by failing to cancel the AWS or by activating the driver's safety device. He looked out of his window and he'd seen that the leading carriage was actually derailed, so he'd assumed that 2 Echo 24 had perhaps collided with a small tractor or perhaps a large animal. So he jumped out of the train and went to investigate. I'm not sure whether it was the fog or some other source of confusion, but he didn't realise that the two trains had actually come together, and he reached the rear cab of 2 Echo 27 and thought that it was the leading cab of his own train. Obviously it was unoccupied, but he thought that was because driver Reese had got out of the train to go and protect the line in accordance with his duties. So he got some detonators and a flag and went and did the same towards the rear of the train, thereafter proceeding on to Cowden station, where rail operator Hodges was on duty on the platform and to whom he reported the details of the incident. The next thing to do was to report the incident to the signal box, but upon arrival at the station it emerged that neither men actually knew the signal box's telephone number. Rail operator Hodges had to phone the area supervisor to get the direct number for Oxted's signal box. It was only then he was able to report the details of the incident to Signaller Webb. However, he was only telling Signaller Webb something that he already knew. Signaller Webb had had the forethought to phone the emergency services, and Kent Constabulary, Kent Fire Service, Kent Ambulance Service and the British Transport Police were already staging their response. Even at this early stage, it was clear that 2 Echo 27 was the offending party when it came to this incident. The crew of 2 Echo 24 had done nothing wrong. They were the ones that had the authority to proceed. 2 Echo 27 had been signalled to a stand at Blackham Junction to allow 2 Echo 24 to pass. But why had that train failed to stop at Oscar Delta 58? Was it a technical problem with the train? Was it an issue with the signalling equipment? Or was the cause more associated with the conduct of the driver and guard on board? With the emergency response to the collision at Cowden well underway, attention now turned to what had caused the incident in the first place. The investigation, led by Major Kit Holden, had looked initially at whether 2 Echo 27 had suffered some kind of technical failure. Perhaps the AWS, the automatic warning system on the train, had somehow failed to operate. The automatic warning system is very old, but its success lies in its simplicity. On the approach to signals showing danger aspects, those showing cautionary aspects, and on the approach to major reductions in speed, magnets are placed between the running rails. As trains pass over those magnets, they have train-borne equipment on the underneath. The magnet will activate this equipment, which will in turn set off an activation in the cab that sounds an alarm. The driver has around 2 seconds to respond to that alarm and press a button in the cab to cancel the alarm sounding. If he or she fails to do that, the emergency brake will apply. It must be stated that these systems do not relieve the driver of his or her responsibility for observing and reacting to prevailing signals, but they do supply vital assistance, especially in weather conditions of the type that were being experienced on the Uckfield line that day. The thought was that perhaps as 2 Echo 27 had approached Oscar Delta 58, the AWS system had simply failed to operate, which had in some way contributed to driver Barton failing to recognise the fact that the signal was at danger. Major Holden arranged for the AWS equipment from the train to be forensically examined by experts. But because of the damage to it, they couldn't conclusively say whether it was working or not. But judging on circumstantial evidence and their best educated guess, they were fairly happy in stating that it was more likely than not that the AWS was in full working order. The next line of investigation revolved around Oscar Delta 58 itself. It was claimed by some that the signal wasn't as bright as it perhaps should have been, that the lens was dirty, and that it wasn't aligned properly with the driver's eye line, thus making it more difficult for a driver to sight it and to react to it. Major Holden arranged for a gaggle of experts to attend the site of the signal and examine it closely. And although it was agreed that the alignment of the signal wasn't by any means ideal, and that the signal head itself was dirty, it was still more than compliant with the minimum requirements. So there was no real operational reason why, even taking into account the fog, driver Barton shouldn't have seen it. Attention now focused on the men operating the train themselves. One of the more shocking or surprising reactions to this incident was the very vocal suggestion that the driver Barton, wasn't driving the train at all. It was actually claimed that guard Brett Andrews was at the controls of the train at the point it had passed Oscar Delta 58. Now this wasn't unknown, it has to be said, but it doesn't make it any less troubling. There certainly wasn't any hard evidence or smoking gun that could say that Brett Andrews was at the controls. But we do know that he was in the driving cab at the point of collision. He actually had no operational reason to be there. Brett Andrews had been a guard for around 10 years, but he'd repeatedly tried to gain progression to the driver grade, but had failed for various reasons. But in the 2 years leading up to the incident, he'd been disciplined no less than 3 times for being in the driving cab when he shouldn't have been. Further to this, one of the passengers who survived the collision, a Mr. Stone, had boarded the train at Buxted with his wife. Mr. Stone was reportedly concerned that he hadn't been able to buy a ticket before boarding. As such, he watched the train roll into the platform because he was looking out for the guard. And as the driving cab went past him, he told the investigators that he'd seen 2 members of staff in that driving cab. Another passenger, a Dr. B.A. Lawton, had been travelling from Uckfield to London on that day. She made some detailed notes for investigators about her memories of the journey. In the early part of the journey, she'd said that between Uckfield and Crowborough, the train seemed to be driven quite fast, and also that it was driven in a very jerky and clumsy fashion. Dr. Lawton's notes then went on to say that the behaviour of the train seemed to smooth itself out upon leaving Crowborough. I would draw 2 conclusions. The first one is about the way in which the train was being controlled. Let's look at driver Barton. He had been qualified for less than a year. If you are driving a train on a rural line with very few landmarks and you don't have a lot of experience and you're driving against a public timetable, it's not unusual for a driver to feel an elevated sense of anxiety, which can then translate itself into the way in which he or she manipulates the controls of that train. While some did jump on that as some kind of evidence, that it doesn't necessarily prove anything other than it was a very inexperienced driver and he was likely feeling the pressure of keeping to time in the fog. The second conclusion kind of flies in the face of the claim that because the train was being driven so jerkily and clumsily in the first part of the journey, that meant that Brett Andrews was driving the train when it crashed. It's more likely, if we're going to follow that thread, that Brett Andrews was driving the train in the early part of the journey, but that they swapped over at Crowborough and driver Barton was driving the train at the point of collision. When it comes to the performance of the train, even taking into account Dr. Lawton's notes, the evidence is contradictory. Even the forensic examination of the remains of driver Barton and guard Brett Andrews failed to yield any definitive direction. The force of the collision had pushed both bodies through the back wall of the driving cab and pinned them up against the roof of their train. Now, the interesting thing was that each person had noticeably different injuries, obviously both fatal, but different enough for the coroner to detail it in his official report. Major Holden was confident in his findings that driver Barton was wholly responsible for the collision between trains 2 Echo 27 and 2 Echo 24. The question of who had been driving was one that could never really be resolved to full satisfaction. But that wasn't the only function of the investigation, because another job of the investigation was to look at what had happened and ask the question of how this might be prevented if it were to happen again. Those killed and those traumatised in the awful collision that took place at Cowden will always be remembered, as is inscribed on this memorial at the station platform. The investigation had looked at all manner of issues, from allegations regarding crew conduct right through to the performance of the line-side signalling. One of the first ones was why Signaller Webb had been unable to contact either of the trains to tell them what was about to happen. This was one of the biggest tragedies of the whole story, because a new system was actually in the process of being rolled out. But because of the building of the Channel Tunnel, funding had allegedly been diverted away from that programme. Across the southeast, a system known as Cab Secure Radio, or CSR, was being rolled out on a number of locations. Now, for the first time in railway history, this would allow a signaller to make a direct transmission to a prescribed train and speak to that driver on a secure channel. Prior to that, we'd relied on 2 things. The first being a fixed telephone bolted to the post of a signal, and the second being a system known as NRN, or National Radio Network. The National Radio Network was an abysmal system, but it was the best that was available in so many locations. It could only handle one call at any one time, despite the country being divided into huge geographical areas. The driver could dial a telephone number that was available on the railway telephone exchange, but there was no way for a signaller, or for anyone else for that matter, to directly contact a driver because they didn't know the specific radio unit that was on each train. On the Oxted to Uckfield line in particular, to try and combat the problem of communication black spots, a supply of cellular telephones were kept in the supervisor's office at Oxted, but the driver would have to specifically go and request one. Otherwise, the station supervisor might simply forget to offer one. The investigation then looked at the changes to the route itself. In 1990, big swathes of double-tracked railway were replaced by single lines to reduce cost. But the scandalous thing was, no risk assessment was ever conducted. Tellingly, the users group that represented passengers on that line had released a newsletter not long before the crash, saying that they were fearful that an incident like this just might happen. Major Holden instructed Railtrack to make sure they, in future, would conduct thorough and audited risk assessments. Now, if you remember, there was also the question about whether the AWS, the automatic warning system on the train, was inoperative. Major Holden made recommendations that at maintenance depots an AWS magnet should be positioned so that every train would pass over them on the way out of the maintenance depot to make sure that that AWS was working. The investigation focused also on whether or not driver Barton had been critically distracted as he approached Blackham Junction. Now, if you recall, guard Brett Andrews was riding in the cab with him, and there was that question as to whether Brett Andrews was actually driving, although it has to be said that there was no firm conclusive evidence, so what we have to do is assume that driver Barton was driving, because in any case, he carried the legal responsibility. Major Holden had directed Railtrack and other interested parties to conduct something known as a SPADRAM. Now, this is kind of a working group of the great and the good when it comes to operational practice. For my money, it would have been much more advisable to look at this in two ways. The first one being in terms of how the operational management around guard Brett Andrews had conducted themselves in trying to tackle that problem, because despite the fact that he'd been disciplined 3 times in 2 years, he hadn't had any formal action taken against him. Now, I'm not asking for someone to be flagged, hung, drawn and quartered, but what I am saying is, where you have a member of safety critical staff who is showing a definite pattern of uncompliant behaviour, it's incumbent upon the operational management around that individual to take action to correct it. And in my mind, the action taken to correct it wasn't decisive enough, because if it was, he wouldn't have been in the cab. And that's not to lay all the blame for this at Brett Andrews, because that wouldn't be fair. He was a human being who made a bad decision, but it wasn't the first time he'd made that decision. So my point there is that the operations management around him had failed to take that decisive action that was necessary to correct that behaviour. My second point here is more centred around equipping drivers with the skills to manage those distractions much more effectively. And this kind of human factors side of operations management wasn't properly appreciated at the time. And to an extent, it probably still isn't, because those that made the decisions within what was BR and which was then morphing into Railtrack simply didn't appreciate the value of looking at these human factors strategies, the situational awareness, what we now call non-technical skills, in a way that could help drivers navigate those situations. In addition to all this, as those 2 tracks at Blackham Junction came into one, there was no additional warning or protection for any train that was making an unauthorised movement. It was recommended that there be some kind of SPAD warning installed. SPAD indicator is a special type of 3-aspect signal. It's got a blue background on it. In addition to that, it has a red aspect at the top, a red aspect at the bottom, and a middle aspect with the word SPAD written on it. So if any train makes an unauthorised move past the signal at danger, an AWS magnet will make a warning in the cab and those lights will flash. Now, the rule book is very, very explicit. If you see one of these as a driver illuminated, even if it's not applying to your line, you stop and you do not move until the signaller tells you it's safe to do so. And if one of those had been present at Blackham Junction, the crew in that driving cab would have known that they'd have passed the signal. In addition to all those recommendations, it was also noted that the presence of an automatic train protection system would have completely avoided the incident. Now, Major Holden's recommendations were also focused upon the rolling stock because it fared terribly. And much of this was due to a phenomenon known as telescoping, which are described in the previous video. Part of the recommendation was firstly to look at getting rid of Mark I rolling stock altogether, but as an interim measure there were all sorts of initiatives looked at. The most notable one for me was called cupping and coning, where you would have the buffer beams of each vehicle altered so that they had a male and a female component on opposing sides. Now, in the event of a collision, those vehicles would come together and the male and the female component would then engage with each other. And that would prevent the chassis from rolling up and over. And what we also had was a focus on the rules regarding how faults with the AWS might be reported. Because there was a suggestion that the AWS wasn't working, the question was asked why driver Barton hadn't let the authorities know. Well, there was a requirement for him to do so, but there wasn't a timescale. So he could very well have waited to the end of his shift to let them know, and that would have been fine. He also suggested that a timescale be put on the reporting of AWS faults, and that is now the case. If you suffer one of these faults, you have to stop and report it immediately, and this has made the railway immeasurably safer. The story of Cowden represents two sides of a coin. One side, you've got this stark illustration of the shortcomings of the network and how, had they only have been brought into the modern time by a reasonable effort, those lives may not have been lost. But at the same time, you've also got that clear roadmap. From the point at which this fatal accident happened, you have that course plotted to a safer railway. So you have those two competing visions. You've got the vision of where it was and the vision of why it was, and you've got the vision of what it became. And that, to me, is the essence of why, with every incident, the railway should become safer for us all.